The wind howled a mournful tune, rattling the single grimy window pane of the Bender Inn. Outside, the last vestiges of twilight bled across the flat expanse of the Kansas prairie, painting the horizon in bruised purples and dull oranges. Inside, a single lantern cast dancing shadows, illuminating the worn wooden tables and the perpetually damp floor. John Bender Sr., a hulking man whose silence was often more unsettling than a shout, sat hunched over a half-eaten plate of stew, his eyes fixed on the flickering flame. Kate, his daughter, moved with a practiced grace that belied the rough-and-tumble surroundings. Her auburn hair, usually neatly pinned, had escaped its confines, framing a face that could be strikingly beautiful, or disturbingly cold, depending on the light. She poured a fresh cup of coffee for their lone guest, a traveling merchant named Silas Thorne, whose nervous fidgeting was a testament to the inn's unsettling atmosphere. "Another cold one?" Silas muttered, rubbing his hands together. "Don't recall a winter this harsh in a decade." Ma Bender, a woman whose every line and wrinkle seemed carved by hardship, grunted from her perch by the hearth. "Winter ain't the problem, mister. It's what the winter brings." Her gaze, sharp and knowing, flickered to John Jr., who sat polishing a hunting knife with an unsettling intensity, his thin lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. John Jr. was a study in contrasts, a wiry frame that hinted at surprising strength, and eyes that held a depth of mischief that bordered on malice. He ignored Ma's comment, his focus solely on the blade, the rhythmic shink-shink of the whetstone, the only sound competing with the wind. Kate placed the coffee before Silas. "Don't mind, Ma," she said, her voice surprisingly soft, a stark contrast to the hard edges of her family. "She worries." Silas took a grateful sip. "Can't blame her. This prairie, it swallows folks whole. Heard tell of a family, just last month, vanished without a trace up north. Heading to Osage City they were." A momentary, almost imperceptible tension rippled through the Bender family. John Sr. shifted in his seat. Ma's grip tightened on the arm of her chair. John Jr.'s knife polishing ceased, his head cocked, as if listening to a distant sound. Only Kate remained outwardly unperturbed, her expression carefully neutral. "That so?" Kate asked, her voice still even. "Lots of folks moving through, looking for a new start. Easy to get lost out here." "Lost, or worse," Silas murmured, his eyes darting to John Jr.'s still hand, then quickly away. "They say the land itself holds secrets." John Jr. resumed his task, the shink-shink resuming its hypnotic rhythm. "Secrets are everywhere, mister. You just gotta know where to look." His gaze, unsettlingly direct, met Silas's for a fleeting second, sending a shiver down the merchant's spine. The conversation dwindled, replaced by the wind and the crackling fire. Silas, despite the warmth of the coffee, felt a growing chill. He had intended to stay the night, but the air in the inn felt heavy, thick with unspoken things. He found himself imagining the vanished family, their hopes, their journey, ending here in the vast indifferent emptiness. I think I'll push on," Silas announced suddenly, pushing his chair back with a scrape that echoed in the quiet room. "Got an early start to make. Don't want to miss the morning market in Cherryvale?" Ma Bender's eyes narrowed. "Foolish to travel at night, mister. Especially alone." "I've got a good horse," Silas insisted, already reaching for his coat. "And a lantern. Be fine." He fumbled with the clasp, his hands trembling slightly. Kate stepped forward, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Perhaps a nightcap then, before you brave the cold? A little something to warm your bones?" She held up a small, amber-colored bottle. Silas hesitated. The thought of another moment in this inn, under the watchful, unnerving eyes of the Benders, was almost unbearable. Yet Kate's smile was disarmingly kind, and the thought of the freezing journey ahead was daunting. "Just a small one then," he conceded, his voice barely a whisper. As Kate poured the liquid into a glass, her back momentarily to the family, John Jr. caught his father's eye. A brief, almost imperceptible nod passed between them. The wind outside picked up, rattling the inn's single flimsy door. Silas took the offered glass, raising it to his lips. He noticed, just as the bitter taste hit him, that Kate's smile had not quite reached her eyes. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved into a swirling darkness was John Jr., slowly, deliberately, sheathing his newly sharpened knife. The wind, carrying the scent of drying prairie grass and distant wood smoke, toyed with Kate's bonnet strings as she swept the porch. It wasn't a gentle breeze but a persistent, almost urgent breath against her cheek. She paused, broom bristles suspended, and listened. The air itself seemed to hum with unspoken things, a low thrum beneath the chirping crickets, and the rustle of cottonwood leaves. Later that evening the same wind rattled the panes in the Bender's cabin as John Jr. carved a crude wooden bird. His father, old John, grumbled about the draft, pulling his threadbare shawl tighter. But it was Kate who felt the true weight of the wind's message. Earlier, during a rare trip to Cherryvale for supplies, she'd overheard hushed conversations at the general store, fragments of worry about missing travelers. A lone rider, a peddler, a family heading west, all vanished without a trace along the Osage Trail, their last known stop often the Bender establishment. "Heard anything new, Pa?" Kate asked, her voice light, as she set a steaming bowl of stew on the table. Old John merely grunted, stirring his stew with a calloused finger. "Just the usual nonsense," he mumbled. "Folks always go missing. Wilds ain't for the faint of heart." But the way he avoided her gaze, focusing intently on his bowl, spoke volumes. Even Ma Bender, usually so effusive with her pronouncements, was unusually quiet, her needlework laid aside. The next morning brought a stranger to their door, a tall, gaunt man with a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that missed nothing. He introduced himself as Colonel York, a relative of a missing doctor named William York. The doctor, he explained, had been traveling to Independence, and was last seen in this vicinity. "We saw no such man, sir," old John declared, his voice gruff, his hand resting on the axe handle near the doorframe. "Ain't seen many folks at all, truth be told. Winter's coming." Kate, however, felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She met Colonel York's gaze, a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or shared understanding, passing between them. He didn't seem convinced by old John's bluster. His eyes swept over the cabin, lingering on the cellar door, and the freshly turned earth near the well. "My brother," Colonel York continued, his voice steady, "was quite distinctive. A gold watch, a fine horse." John Jr., who had been meticulously cleaning his rifle by the fire, dropped a small component with a clatter. Kate shot him a look, a silent warning. The colonel's gaze sharpened, momentarily leaving old John. "Many men carry gold watches, sir," Kate interjected smoothly, stepping forward. "And a good horse is a common thing on the trail. Perhaps he took a different route. The weather has been unpredictable." Colonel York's eyes returned to her, a hint of something unreadable in their depths. He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps," he said, the word drawn out. "But I shall continue my inquiries. Good day to you all." As he rode away, the wind picked up, whipping dust devils across the yard. Kate watched him go, a knot tightening in her stomach. The whispers on the wind were no longer just a feeling. They were taking shape, carried on the words of a determined man. The illusion of isolation, of their secluded existence, was beginning to fray at the edges. They were no longer invisible. Dr. York's search. The late afternoon sun, a weak tea-colored light, did little to dispel the chill permeating Dr. York's study. Dust motes danced in the anemic beams, illuminating stacks of brittle newspapers and dog-eared ledgers. He leaned back, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose, a sigh escaping his lips. The official reports from the Osage County Sheriff's Office were infuriatingly brief, almost dismissive, considering the horrific nature of the Bender family's alleged crimes. "Disappeared without a trace," they read, as if a family of 4 could simply evaporate from the Kansas prairie. He pushed away the flimsy papers, the crinkle of aged newsprint echoing in the quiet room. His gaze fell upon a well-worn leather-bound journal, the diary of a local merchant who had passed through Labette County just weeks before the Benders' hasty flight. Dr. York had acquired it from the merchant's widow, a transaction that had cost him a considerable sum, and several awkward conversations about morbid curiosities. He flipped it open to a marked page. The merchant, one Mr. Silas Thorne, had written, in a spidery script, about a peculiar family, the Benders, who kept a tidy inn but possessed an unsettling stillness in their eyes. Thorne had also mentioned a rumor, whispered by a transient, of strange digging, late at night behind the Bender homestead. Strange digging. The phrase snagged in Dr. York's mind. It wasn't in any official account. He stood, pacing the small room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The official search had focused on the cellar, the barn, the immediate vicinity, but what if the Benders had been more cunning, more meticulous? A thought struck him, cold and sharp. The Benders' property backed onto a thick copse of cottonwoods, a dense tangle of undergrowth and gnarled branches. Locals tended to avoid it, citing a deep-seated fear of rattlesnakes and bad luck. He remembered a detail from an old survey map he'd seen at the county clerk's office. A small, almost imperceptible dip in the land on the far edge of that wood, marked simply as low ground. He grabbed his worn leather satchel, stuffing in a few essential tools, a small hand trowel, a compass, and a coil of thin rope. He also added a flask of lukewarm coffee, and a tin of biscuits, knowing this search might take him well into the evening. The air outside was crisp, carrying the faint scent of drying prairie grass. Dr. York saddled his mare, Bess, her breath pluming in the cooling air. The ride to the Bender property was familiar now, almost a pilgrimage. The abandoned cabin stood stark against the fading light, its windows like vacant eyes. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, ran down his spine. He dismounted Bess near the edge of the cottonwood copse, tying her loosely to a sturdy branch. The woods were darker than he'd anticipated, the intertwining branches forming a skeletal canopy. The ground was uneven, treacherous with hidden roots and decaying leaves. He pushed deeper, guided by his memory of the map and an almost instinctive pull. Minutes stretched into an hour. He stumbled, catching himself on a thorny bush, a sharp prickle on his hand. Then, he saw it. A subtle depression in the earth, half hidden by a fallen log and a thicket of weeds. It wasn't a natural hollow. The ground here felt different, softer, as if recently disturbed. He knelt, pulling out his trowel, and began to carefully scrape away the top layer of soil. The scent of damp earth mingled with something else, something metallic and faintly sickly sweet, unmistakable to a man who had seen his share of medical cadavers. His heart hammered against his ribs. He dug faster, the soil crumbling away, revealing a dark, stained canvas. He tugged at it, revealing a human foot, clad in a worn boot. The rest of the body was clearly discernible beneath the thin layer of soil. He covered it quickly, his hands trembling. He had found it. The Benders' dark secret, finally unearthed. The note, folded precisely into a small square, sat on Ma Bender's chipped ceramic plate. John Bender Sr. regarded it with a mixture of suspicion, and a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of interest. He dabbed a greasy rag at his moustache. "What's this then?" His voice was a gravelly rumble, a sound that usually preceded a command or a complaint. Kate, perched on her stool, her eyes sparkling with an almost mischievous light, picked it up. "It's an invitation, Pa." She unfolded it with a flourish, the coarse paper crinkling softly. "From the Shermans, for supper. Tomorrow night." Old Man Bender scoffed, a short, sharp burst of air. "Shermans? Why in tarnation would they invite us?" The Bender family wasn't exactly known for their social graces or their widespread popularity. Their isolated inn, miles from any real settlement, was a place people passed through, not a destination for convivial evenings. "They're new in the area, Pa," John Jr. offered from his spot by the hearth, whittling idly at a piece of pine. "Setting up that new dry goods store in Cherryvale. Maybe they're just being neighborly." His tone was flat, almost uninterested, but a quick glance at his hands revealed a slight tightening around the whittling knife. Ma Bender, her face a mask of practiced indifference, continued to stir a pot of simmering stew. Yet, a subtle shift in her posture, a slight stiffening of her shoulders, betrayed a hidden consideration. "Neighborly indeed," she murmured, her voice a low drone. "Or perhaps they've heard tell of our hospitality." Her gaze flickered to the trapdoor hidden beneath the rug in the center of the room, a fleeting, almost imperceptible movement. Kate, however, was undeterred. "It says they're keen to meet everyone. Especially us. They've heard good things." She paused, a small smile playing on her lips. "And they're bringing their daughter, Clara. She's around my age, Ma." This detail seemed to penetrate Ma Bender's carefully constructed apathy. She stopped stirring, the ladle suspended over the pot. "A daughter, you say?" Her eyes, usually as dull as river stones, held a glint of something sharper, more calculating. "Well then, it might be profitable to accept." John Sr. grumbled again. But the fight had gone out of him. The promise of potential gain, however vague, often held sway over his usual cantankerousness. "Fine. But don't expect me to wear my Sunday best." The following evening, as dusk bled across the Kansas prairie, the Benders made their way to the Shermans' newly erected homestead. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. The Shermans' house, though modest, boasted a freshly painted porch and windows that gleamed in the fading light. Inside, the atmosphere was surprisingly warm. Mr. and Mrs. Sherman, a pleasant, if somewhat naive-looking couple, greeted them with genuine smiles. Clara, a girl with kind eyes and a nervous laugh, instantly took to Kate, and they retreated to a corner, chattering animatedly. The dinner itself was a simple affair: roasted chicken, boiled potatoes, and fresh bread. But it was the conversation that truly held the Benders' attention. Mr. Sherman, oblivious to the predatory glint in Ma Bender's eyes, spoke enthusiastically of his plans for the store, of the new settlers arriving, of the money to be made. He spoke of his own small savings, of the valuables he hoped to acquire for the store, of the occasional travelers who passed through Cherryvale with their purses full. Ma Bender listened, her expression unreadable, her fork moving mechanically to her mouth. John Sr., unusually quiet, occasionally grunted in agreement. John Jr. kept his eyes on his plate, but his ears were clearly attuned to every word. Kate, while seemingly engrossed with Clara, missed nothing. As the evening wore on, the Shermans, emboldened by the Benders' apparent friendliness, began to speak of their own history, of their journey west, of the small inheritance that had allowed them to open the store. They spoke of the loneliness of the prairie, and their hope for new friends. When it was time to leave, the Shermans pressed them to visit again soon. Ma Bender offered a thin, almost genuine smile. "We'd be delighted, Mr. Sherman." Truly. As they walked back under the vast star-peppered sky, the silence was heavy, charged with unspoken thoughts. The dinner, far from being a simple social call, had been a reconnaissance mission. And the Benders had gathered a wealth of information, a dark secret revealed. The flickering gaslight in the parlor did little to dispel the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows that mimicked the unrest in Kate Bender's stomach. Ma Bender's usual placid expression was replaced with a rigid severity, her eyes like chips of flint as she watched Pa Bender pace before the cold hearth. John Jr. sat hunched on a stool, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the peeling wallpaper. "We can't keep him here," John Jr. finally rasped, the words thick with a fear that had been building for days. "Someone will come looking." He was expected in Independence by now. Pa Bender stopped, his heavy boot thudding on the worn floorboards. "And what do you propose, boy? Toss him in the river, and hope he floats to Kansas City?" His voice was a low growl, laced with a dangerous edge Kate knew all too well. Ma Bender finally spoke, her voice surprisingly calm, cutting through the strained silence. "The cellar. It's deep enough. And the ground is still soft from the rains." She glanced at Kate, a silent command passing between them. Kate felt a cold dread settle in her bones, a familiar feeling whenever their guests stayed too long. "No," Kate said, her voice barely a whisper, but firm enough to draw all eyes to her. "Not the cellar, not again. There are too many." The words hung in the air, revealing the unspoken horror they all shared. The earth beneath their feet was a graveyard, and the weight of their secrets was becoming unbearable. Pa Bender's eyes narrowed, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "What are you suggesting, girl? That we become squeamish now, after all we've done?" He took a menacing step towards her. "I'm suggesting we stop," Kate retorted, finding a sudden surge of courage. "This isn't sustainable. The rumors are starting. People are asking questions." She thought of the persistent drummer from Wichita, the one who'd ridden past just yesterday, his eyes lingering on their isolated cabin. A low, guttural sound escaped Pa Bender's throat. Before Kate could react, his hand shot out, catching her across the face with a brutal crack. Her head snapped back, a searing pain blooming on her cheek. She stumbled, clutching the table for support, the taste of blood metallic in her mouth. "You will not question me, girl," Pa Bender roared, his face a mask of primal fury. "You will do as you are told. We are a family and we protect our own by any means necessary." John Jr. sprang up, a desperate fire in his eyes. "Father, no. She's right. We must be more careful." Ma Bender stepped between them, her presence an unexpected barrier. "Enough." Her voice, though not loud, carried an undeniable authority that even Pa Bender seemed to heed. She turned to Kate, her expression softening infinitesimally. "Kate, go to the shed. Fetch the spade and the lamp." Her voice was a low murmur now, almost an appeal. "We have no choice, child. This is our life now." As Kate walked to the shed, the cold night air biting at her raw cheek, the truth of Ma Bender's words echoed in her mind. No choice. Not anymore. The first time, it had been an accident, a desperate act of self-preservation against a man who had threatened them. But then the fear had curdled into something colder, something calculating. Each subsequent disappearance had chipped away at their humanity, leaving behind a hollow shell filled with dread and a terrifying sense of inevitability. The weight of the earth itself seemed to press down on her, a chilling testament to the dark secret buried beneath the Bender family farm, the empty inn. The wind, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, rattled the loose pane in the parlor window. John Bender Sr., a man whose perpetual scowl seemed carved from the prairie itself, wiped his hands on his grimy apron. His usually bloodshot eyes held a flicker of something new, a nervous energy that belied his gruff exterior. Ma Bender, a figure of silent, watchful intensity, sat by the cold hearth, her gnarled fingers absently smoothing the folds of her worn calico dress. The silence in the inn, usually broken by the creak of floorboards or the murmur of passing travelers, was now profound, almost suffocating. "They'll be here soon," John rumbled, his voice a low growl that barely filled the cavernous room. He glanced towards the door, then back at Ma, as if seeking confirmation of some shared unspoken truth. Ma Bender simply nodded, her gaze unblinking. Her stillness was more unsettling than any outburst. John Jr., younger and far more prone to fits of temper, paced the length of the narrow hallway, his boots thudding a restless rhythm against the bare planks. Kate, the youngest and most outwardly charming, sat at the small, wobbly table in the dining room, meticulously polishing a tarnished silver spoon that had seen better days. Her usual vivacity was muted, replaced by a focused intensity that made her seem older than her years. "We need to decide," John Jr. finally burst out, stopping abruptly in the doorway, his face flushed. "Do we do it, or do we not?" He looked from his father to his mother, his eyes pleading for a definitive answer. The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, though its true meaning was chillingly clear. Ma Bender rose slowly, her movements deliberate. She walked to the window and peered out at the darkening landscape, her silhouette stark against the fading light. "The land is ours," she said, her voice surprisingly soft, yet imbued with an iron will. "And the inn is ours. What comes through it is ours." Her words, simple as they were, carried the weight of a decree. A collective shiver seemed to pass through the family. Kate's polishing slowed, then stopped. John Sr. swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on his wife. John Jr. ran a hand through his unkempt hair, a flicker of fear, mixed with grim resolve in his eyes. Suddenly, the distant clatter of hooves on the dirt road broke the oppressive silence. All four Benders froze, their heads swiveling towards the sound. The distinct rattle of wagon wheels grew louder, closer. "They're here," John Sr. whispered, a tremor in his voice. He glanced at the trapdoor concealed beneath the rug in the parlor. The wood above it was stained, discolored in a way that only a keen eye might notice. Kate, her earlier composure shattered, stood up abruptly, knocking over the polished spoon. It clattered to the floor with a metallic ring that echoed unnaturally in the suddenly hushed inn. She looked at her father, her eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and a dawning terrible understanding. "Father," she began, her voice barely a whisper, but John Sr. cut her off with a sharp, warning glance. The wagon pulled to a stop directly outside the inn. A man's hearty laugh, followed by the deeper timbre of another, filtered through the thick oak door. Kate quickly composed herself, a practiced smile already forming on her lips, a mask of welcoming charm slipping into place. John Jr. retreated to the kitchen, a heavy iron skillet already in his hand. Ma Bender positioned herself by the hearth, her back to the door, a silent sentinel. John Sr. walked to the door, and, with a deep breath, pulled it open, his face a carefully constructed tableau of weary hospitality. "Welcome, gentlemen," he boomed, his voice surprisingly robust. "Welcome to the Bender Inn. You've found yourselves a warm bed and a good meal, I promise you that." The wind, as if on cue, swirled into the inn, carrying with it the undeniable scent of the approaching night and a chilling premonition. Horrors uncovered. The air in the Bender cabin was thick with the stench of decay, a cloying sweetness that made Sadie's stomach churn. John Bender Sr., his face a mask of feigned innocence, waved a hand dismissively at the faint odor. "Just a dead varmint under the floorboards, I reckon." happens in these old places. But Sadie knew better. The smell was too deep, too pervasive. She exchanged a glance with Jonathan, whose jaw was set in a grim line. Their initial foray into the cabin had been met with polite, if slightly unnerving, hospitality from Ma Bender. Now, with the menfolk gone on a supposed hunting trip, the women were left to straighten up for the expected arrival of the land agent. "Let's get those rugs aired out, Ma Bender," Sadie said, forcing a smile. "They look a mite dusty." It was their pre-arranged signal. The heavy, braided rugs, suspiciously placed, were their first target. Ma Bender, surprisingly compliant, gestured vaguely towards the door. "Help yourselves, dearie. My old back ain't what it used to be." As Sadie wrestled with a particularly large rug near the back wall, Jonathan began meticulously sweeping the dirt floor, his eyes scanning every irregularity. The floorboards, uneven and crudely cut, shifted under Sadie's weight, revealing a sliver of darkness beneath. A fresh wave of the sickening odor wafted up. She knelt, feigning to adjust the rug, and peered into the gap. "Jonathan," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic thud of Ma Bender's bread-making. "Over here." He moved to her side, his broom clattering against the wall, a deliberate noise to cover their hushed exchange. His gaze followed hers to the dark void. A single distinct sound emerged from the depths, a faint metallic clinking. "It's a chain," he breathed, his face paling. "And, is that a hand?" Sadie felt a cold dread seep into her bones. The shape was unmistakable, a skeletal hand, its fingers curled inward, barely visible in the gloom. They quickly replaced the rug, their movements stiff with a shared, unspoken horror. "We need to get out of here," Jonathan muttered, his eyes darting towards Ma Bender, whose back was turned to them as she kneaded dough with surprising force. "Not yet," Sadie insisted, her voice trembling but firm. "We need proof. Something undeniable." Her gaze fell upon the small, lidded barrel in the corner, ostensibly for rainwater collection. A thin, dark line snaked from its base, disappearing into the floorboards. Ma Bender, sensing their pause, turned. Her eyes, usually rheumy, held a sudden, sharp glint. "Everything to your liking, dearies." Her smile was too wide, too fixed. "Just admiring your craftsmanship, Ma Bender," Jonathan said, his voice surprisingly steady. "That barrel, such a clever design." Before Ma Bender could respond, Sadie moved towards the barrel. "May I get a drink?" "I'm parched from all this cleaning." Ma Bender hesitated for a fraction of a second, her smile faltering. "Oh, it's just rainwater, dear, not very fresh." But Sadie was already lifting the lid. The sight within made her gasp. The barrel wasn't filled with water but with a dark, viscous liquid teeming with flies. A chill that had nothing to do with the cool air of the cabin snaked up her spine. This wasn't rainwater. This was blood. A guttural sound escaped Ma Bender's throat. Her eyes, now completely devoid of warmth, fixed on Sadie. "You shouldn't have done that, girl." Her voice, previously soft and folksy, had taken on a hard, metallic edge. Jonathan, reacting instantly, shoved Sadie behind him. "We know what you are doing here, Ma Bender," he declared, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and righteous anger. "We know about the bodies." The air crackled with a sudden, dangerous silence. Ma Bender's smile returned, this time a truly terrifying rictus. "It appears," she said, her voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper, "that you know too much." From beneath her apron, a glint of steel emerged, the hunt for the Benders. The scent of damp earth and pine needles clung to them as they tracked. Sheriff Moody, his brow furrowed in a permanent scowl, led the small contingent. Behind him followed a determined Deputy Riley, and then a scattering of local men, farmers mostly, their faces grim, their hands calloused and ready for whatever lay ahead. The Bender farm was a ghost in the distance, a silent testament to the horrors they'd uncovered. Now, the hunt was on. They didn't take much. Moody grunted, kicking at a half-buried tin cup near a faint, overgrown path. "Just enough to vanish." Riley nodded, scanning the dense foliage. "A wagon, maybe. 2 horses. They couldn't have gone far, not with the little head start they had." The sun, a pale disk behind a hazy sky, offered little warmth. The air was crisp, carrying the distant caw of a crow, a mournful, solitary sound that seemed to echo their grim task. Their first stop, was the neighboring homestead, a small, unpainted cabin belonging to the Svenssons. Mrs. Svensson, a gaunt woman with eyes that had seen too much, wrung her hands. They came by, Sheriff. John and Kate said they were heading to Independence, to see about some land. Her voice was a thin whisper. It was late, just before dawn. I didn't think anything of it then. Did they have a wagon? Riley pressed gently. A covered one. And 2 horses, yes. Looked like they were in a hurry. She wrung her apron. Didn't stop for coffee, which was unusual for John Bender. Always liked his coffee. Moody exchanged a look with Riley. Independence was a logical direction, a hub of activity where 2 people, even a family, could melt into the crowd. But it was also a sizable journey, particularly in a hurry. They rode on, pushing their horses hard, the rhythmic thud of hooves on the soft ground the only sound for long stretches. The trail, initially clear, began to grow faint, crisscrossing with other wagon ruts and animal tracks. By mid-afternoon, they reached a crossroads where 3 dirt roads converged. One led south towards Independence, another east towards the more settled towns, and the third, a less traveled track, veered north into wilder, untamed territory. Which way? One of the farmers asked, his voice laced with impatience. The day was drawing to a close, and the prospect of a night spent tracking, or worse, losing the trail entirely, weighed heavily. Moody dismounted, examining the ground. No distinct tracks here, too many coming and going. He frowned, his gaze sweeping the horizon. The Svenssons said Independence. It's the most obvious route. Maybe too obvious, Riley countered, dismounting beside him. He knelt, running a gloved hand over the dry earth. If they knew we were coming, they wouldn't take the easiest path. He pointed to a faint scuff mark, barely visible, at the edge of the northern path. Look here. A hoofprint. Deeper on one side, like a horse pulling a heavy load. Moody squinted. Could be anyone. Or it could be a deliberate feint. Riley insisted, standing. They're killers, Sheriff. They're not going to make it easy for us. He looked north, at the darkening line of trees, a vast, unbroken wilderness. It's a harder road, but it's also where they'd be least expected. A murmur went through the men. The North Path was known for its rough terrain and sparse settlements. It was a place where people disappeared for good. Moody hesitated, weighing the options. The logical choice was Independence. The gut feeling, fueled by Riley's observation and the chilling nature of their quarry, pulled him north. He looked at Riley, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The deputy's instincts had proven sharp before. All right, Moody announced, his voice firm. We go north. If they're cunning, we'll be cunning too. He remounted, adjusting his hat. Let's move, men, before night swallows us whole. The northern path was indeed harder. The horses struggled over rocks and roots, and the air grew colder as they ascended into higher ground. The trees grew denser, their branches interwoven, forming a canopy that blocked out the last vestiges of the sun. The silence was profound, broken only by the creak of leather and the heavy breathing of the horses. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking danger, every rustle of leaves a potential ambush. The hunt, they all knew, had just begun in earnest.